Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at the JonBenét Ramsey case,
Oh, yeah.
which is, I think, a case that is just fascinating to so many people. And we've got some interesting source material that was provided by you, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be kind of unpacking that and looking at the details of this case.
Absolutely.
And I'm joined, of course, by my expert co-host.
It's a pleasure to be here,
Always a pleasure.
as always.
So let's just jump right in.
Okay.
So JonBenét Ramsey, 6 years old, found murdered in her own home in Boulder, Colorado, Christmas of 1996.
Right.
And
a case that has captivated the public imagination for decades now.
absolutely.
And for good reason.
And for good reason.
So it's got everything.
It's got everything.
It's got mystery, intrigue.
A little beauty queen.
Yeah.
Wealthy family.
Yeah, and right from the beginning.
And all these twists and turns.
Right from the beginning.
Yeah.
So
the crime scene had these really bizarre elements that just screamed staged. Well, that's kind of what I want to talk about first, like right out of the gate. The crime scene was bizarre.
yeah.
The ransom note?
The ransom note.
This 2.5-page ransom note.
2.5 pages long.
Who does that?
You know, and it had this very strange, like, specific ransom amount.
Right.
$118,000.
Right.
And the body wasn't even found until hours after the initial 911 call. So, like, all these details immediately raised red flags.
Right. And obviously immediately suspicion falls on the parents, John and Patsy Ramsey.
Yeah, it's natural.
This theory of, like, accidental death covered up.
It's understandable why people would go there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
The ransom note itself was written on Patsy's notepad
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
with a pen from the house.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then the ransom amount,
that was on her notepad.
yes.
Wow.
And then the ransom amount was suspiciously close to John's bonus that year.
Oh, wow.
So you combine that with the kind of staged feel of the scene.
It really does make them look guilty.
It makes them look like the obvious suspects,
Right.
at least initially.
And, and of course, this is all happening under this intense media scrutiny.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every little detail of their lives is being picked apart.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the ransom note.
Yeah.
But, Patsy's emotional responses during interviews are being analyzed.
The pineapple incident.
Like, what's the pineapple incident?
So they found pineapple in JonBenét's stomach during the autopsy, but the family insisted that she hadn't eaten any pineapple that night.
Oh.
And so this became this huge deal in the media.
Oh, wow.
This tiny detail.
So, like, maybe she had...
Again, this symbol of...
Maybe she snuck some or something.
Yeah, or maybe it was a sign that the Ramseys were lying.
Right.
And it just shows how, like, even the smallest detail can be blown out of proportion in a case like this.
And then you've got JonBenét just completely staunch in his, insistence that they're innocent.
Right.
And all this is playing out in the public eye.
And the pressure must have been immense.
I can't imagine.
You can actually hear it in the police interrogation tapes that you sent.
Yeah.
There's this palpable tension.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You can sense the strain in their voices, the exhaustion, the frustration.
You can hear it in their voices.
Oh, yeah.
That's fascinating.
And as we go further into the sources you provided, we hit this turning point.
Okay.
The introduction of Lou Smith.
Oh, Lou Smith, the detective.
Yeah, he was a seasoned homicide detective. And what's interesting is he initially believed the Ramseys were guilty.
Really?
Yeah.
So he came in thinking they did it?
Just like a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But then he really dove into the evidence.
Oh, okay.
And he completely changed his mind.
He did a total 180.
He became convinced that this wasn't just some accident that got clumsily covered up.
Okay.
This was a deliberate and brutal act.
So what specifically made him change his mind?
I think a lot of it had to do with the sheer brutality of the crime.
The crime itself?
Yeah.
Okay.
The way JonBenét was killed,
Okay.
it just didn't fit the profile of a panicked parent trying to hide a mistake. It was too violent, too calculated.
Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, she was strangled with a garrote.
Oh, wow.
There was evidence of multiple strangulations,
Oh, my God.
and she had a skull fracture.
Oh, my gosh.
And that's not something you typically see in an accidental death.
It's a whole other level.
It suggests a level of rage and premeditation that just didn't make sense if it was the parents.
Right, because it's one thing to say, the parents accidentally, did something or, in a moment of panic.
Right.
But to inflict that much damage
Yeah.
on purpose.
To intentionally inflict that kind of violence on your own child,
it just doesn't
it's a different story.
add up.
And then there's this whole other thing about a stun gun.
Oh, really?
There were these marks on JonBenét's body
Okay.
that some experts thought could only have been made by a stun gun,
Okay.
and the Ramseys didn't own a stun gun.
So that would imply that somebody
Well,
else
yeah, that someone else was involved.
brought a stun gun
Right.
into the house.
And that really bolstered the intruder theory.
Right.
Because if someone else had a stun gun and the Ramseys didn't lead, that points away from them.
So now we're moving away from the parents and more toward the intruder theory.
Exactly. And there were other things at the crime scene that seemed to support that theory.
Okay, like what?
Well, there was an open basement window
Okay.
and a suitcase positioned right under it.
Okay.
Like maybe someone used it to climb in.
Right, so that's a possible entry point.
Exactly. So now you have the stun gun marks the open window,
Yeah.
the suitcase.
It's starting to paint a different picture.
It starts to look less like the parents and more like someone broke in.
Okay, so we've got the focus shifting from the parents to a possible intruder, but
That's not the end of the story.
there's more?
Well, there's more.
No, wait.
This is where the DNA evidence comes in,
Okay.
and it throws a whole new wrench into things.
All right, tell me about the DNA evidence.
So they found DNA under JonBenét's fingernails
Okay.
and in her clothing, and it didn't match any of the Ramseys.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
that's huge.
that cast a lot of doubt on their involvement.
Yeah, because if it's not their DNA, then
Yeah, it means someone else was there.
someone else was there.
And so the investigation starts to broaden.
It branches out.
They start looking beyond the immediate family
Okay.
and start considering other potential suspects.
So who are some of the people that they start looking at?
Well, one of the names that comes up is Gary Oliva.
Gary Oliva.
He was a convicted sex offender,
Okay.
and he lived near the Ramseys.
Okay.
And he had this really creepy obsession with JonBenét.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he even claimed that she visited him in a vision after she died.
Oh, that's scary.
And to make it even creepier, he owned a stun gun.
He owned a stun gun.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you've got a convicted sex offender
Living nearby.
obsessed with JonBenét.
Owns a stun gun.
Owns a stun gun.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And it's important to remember that this is just one of many leads.
Right.
The police got over 3,000 tips in this case.
3,000.
3,000 tips.
Wow, that's a lot of information to sift through.
It's a massive amount of information.
Wow.
And, you have to think about the time period. This is 1986.
Right.
The internet was still in its early stages.
Yeah.
So coordinating all of that information
Yeah.
must have been a logistical nightmare.
I mean, even today that would be tough to do, but
Absolutely.
wow.
So yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, just in this first part.
We've talked about the initial focus on the Ramseys,
Yeah.
Lou Smith's intruder theory,
Mm-hmm.
the DNA evidence.
Right. And it's a lot to process, but I think the big takeaway for me is just how complex this case really is.
Yeah, there's no easy answers here.
There's no easy answers.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Right.
It really makes you think, like how many other cold cases could be solved with today's technology?
Right.
Cases that seemed hopeless years ago might have answers now.
It's pretty amazing to think about.
It is. It really is. And it speaks to how far forensic science has come.
Let's talk about the media for a second.
Okay.
I mean, the media attention on this case was insane.
Oh, yeah. It was a feeding frenzy.
I mean, it felt like the whole world was watching.
It was everywhere.
Do you think that impacted the investigation at all?
I think it definitely played a role.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, the constant media coverage added a ton of pressure to the investigation.
Oh, I'm sure.
Everyone wanted answers and they wanted them fast.
Right.
And that kind of pressure can lead to mistakes.
Right. And I mean, it's not just the pressure on the investigators. You've got the whole court of public opinion thing going on.
Oh, yeah. The Ramseys were basically being tried in the media before all the facts were even in.
And that's got to be tough to deal with.
It is. It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and judgment.
And it can taint the whole process.
Absolutely. It can influence witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
It can affect how evidence is perceived.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
Exactly. The media frenzy feeds the speculation, and the speculation feeds the media frenzy.
And it's all happening while the investigators are trying to do their job.
And it's important to remember that back then, the media landscape was very different.
In what way?
Well, there were only a few major news networks.
Okay.
So they had a lot of power to shape the narrative.
So they really controlled the story.
To a large extent, yes.
Okay, so media coverage definitely played a part.
Absolutely.
But let's get back to the evidence for a minute.
Okay.
There's one thing that's always bugged me about this case.
What's that?
The ransom note.
Ah, yes, the infamous ransom note.
It's almost 2.5 pages long.
I know, it's bizarre, right?
Who writes a ransom note that long?
That's not your typical kidnapping note, that's for sure.
It's like they're trying to write a novel or something.
The language is really dramatic, too.
Over the top.
Yeah, like something out of a movie.
It just doesn't feel authentic.
And that's what makes it so intriguing.
Right, because if it's not a genuine ransom note...
Then what is it?
Exactly.
Some people think it was a deliberate attempt to mislead the investigators.
Like a red herring.
Exactly.
To make it seem...
To make the crime seem more complicated than it really was.
Right, like a professional hit or something.
Right, or to throw suspicion on someone else.
So it's possible the killer wanted to frame someone.
It's definitely a possibility.
But then why use Patsy's notepad and a pen from the house?
That's a good question.
It seems like an amateur move.
It does, doesn't it?
You know, if you're going to stage a crime...
Right.
You'd think you'd bring your own supplies.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
It's almost like they wanted to get caught.
Maybe they weren't thinking clearly.
Maybe they panicked.
Or maybe it was all part of the plan.
To make it look like a mistake.
Exactly. To make it look like an impulsive act rather than a carefully planned one.
So the ransom note could be a genuine attempt at extortion.
Or it could be a carefully crafted deception.
And that makes it really hard to figure out the motive.
It does, because if we assume the note is real...
Then we're looking at a financial motive.
Right. Someone who knew about John's bonus and saw an opportunity...
But if the note's fake...
Then the motive is much harder to pin down.
It could be anything.
Revenge, jealousy, a personal grudge, who knows?
It's like we're dealing with two different cases.
In a way. Yes.
One with a clear financial motive.
And another with a motive that's completely unknown.
That's so frustrating.
It's one of the things that makes this case so difficult to solve.
Okay, so let's get back to Lou Smith's theory.
Okay.
We talked about the stun gun marks and the open basement window.
Right.
But was there anything else that made him think an intruder was involved?
Well, he found John Ramsey to be very credible during the interrogation.
Okay.
He didn't see any of the telltale signs of deception.
Like what kind of signs?
Well, avoiding eye contact.
Okay.
Being overly defensive.
Okay.
Changing their story.
Right.
He didn't see any of that with John.
So he thought John was being truthful.
He thought John was genuinely distraught and focused on finding the killer.
That's interesting.
And he also pointed to the fact that the Ramseys' security system wasn't on that night.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
It's possible that the killer knew how to bypass the system.
Or that they were familiar with the house.
Exactly.
Maybe someone who had been there before.
Someone the Ramseys knew and trusted.
Right, which would explain why there was no forced entry.
Exactly.
So if we're going with Smith's theory, we're looking for someone with a history of violence.
Possibly a sexual predator.
Who knew the Ramseys.
And had access to their home.
That narrows it down a bit.
It does, but it still leaves us with a lot of potential suspects.
Especially with those 3,000 tips.
Exactly. That's a lot of ground to cover.
Do you think all those tips could have actually hurt the investigation?
It's possible.
How so?
Well, having too much information can sometimes be overwhelming.
It can be distracting.
Exactly. It can make it hard to see the forest for the trees.
So it's possible that some important clues got lost in the shuffle.
It's definitely a possibility.
Wow.
And remember, this is before the internet. So investigators had to rely on more traditional methods of communication.
Like phone calls and faxes.
Exactly. It was a much slower process.
And with a case this high profile?
The pressure was on to get results quickly.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the sheer volume of information could have hindered the investigation.
So it's not just about having enough information. It's
Right.
also about being able to manage that information effectively.
Exactly. And to prioritize the most promising leads.
Which is easier said than done.
Especially in a case like this with so many twists and turns.
It makes you wonder
Wait.
if the case would have been solved if it happened today.
That's an interesting question.
I mean, with all the technology we have now,
The DNA databases,
Yeah.
the advanced forensic techniques,
it seems like it would be harder to get away with a crime like this.
it would be much harder to leave no trace.
So maybe JonBenét's killer would have been caught.
Maybe, but we can't know for sure.
Right.
It's all speculation at this point.
But it's fascinating to think about.
That is-
What do you think?
I think it's a reminder that technology is a powerful tool,
Yeah,
but it's not a silver bullet.
right.
There's still a human element to solving crimes.
It's not just about the science.
Exactly. It's about the investigators.
Our intuition,
Their experience.
their ability to connect the dots.
And sometimes it's about luck.
right?
Being in the right place at the right time.
Having that one break that cracks the case wide open.
Exactly. You know, it's amazing we've covered so much ground, and still
Mhm.
it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
It really does, and I think that's why people are still so fascinated by this case even after all these years.
Yeah, there's just so many unanswered questions.
Right, like who killed JonBenét?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and it doesn't seem like we're any closer to an answer.
Well, I don't know about that.
Really?
I mean, think about all the advancements in forensic technology since 1996.
That's true.
Like, DNA testing has come a long way.
Yeah.
They can do things now that they couldn't even dream of back then.
So you're saying there's still hope.
I think so.
What would you do if you were in charge of the investigation today?
Well, first thing I'd do is push for a full re-examination of all the physical evidence.
Using the new technology.
Exactly.
What about the other leads?
Oh, I definitely want to revisit those too.
Like Gary Oliva?
Yeah, him and anyone else who seemed even remotely suspicious.
Would you re-interview any of the witnesses?
Possibly. You know, memories can fade over time.
Right.
Sometimes a fresh perspective can uncover new details.
So you're saying there's still a chance that this case could be solved?
I think there's always a chance.
Even after all this time?
Especially after all this time,
Why do you say that?
because the truth is out there.
Somewhere.
Somewhere.
You just have to find it.
Exactly.
Well, that's a pretty optimistic way to look at it.
I try to be an optimist.
I think that's a good quality to have, especially in this line of work.
Yeah, you have to have faith that the truth will eventually come out.
I hope you're right.
I hope so too, for JonBenét's sake and for her family.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
This case has been a wild ride.
It really has.
From the bizarre crime scene to the media frenzy to the conflicting theories.
It's a case that just keeps on giving.
It really does, and it's a reminder that sometimes even the most baffling mysteries can't be solved.
At least not right away.
But that doesn't mean we should stop searching for answers.
Never stop searching.
Words to live by.
Indeed.
Well, thanks for joining me on this journey.
It's been a pleasure as always.
And to all of you listening out there, keep those tips coming.
And never give up hope.
That's all for this week's deep dive. We'll see you next time.